Thank you very much for joining us. It's much appreciated. My name is Chris Poire. I'm an executive committee member at Team Global, and I'll be moderating this webinar for you this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's much appreciated. And thank you also to Jamie, of course, for giving us an hour of his time this evening. So before we get started, just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded and will be shared on Team Global socials. So a breakdown of the webinar is that we'll have a 20-minute briefing from Jamie on the ongoing tensions in Ukraine at the moment, and then we'll have about 40 minutes or so for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to directly message me through the Zoom direct message feature, and I'll be able to pass these questions on. If you do want to ask Jamie a question directly, feel free to let me know when you're sending me these messages. Before we get started, just to give you a bit of background on Team Global, we're a charity founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement. We're an independent apolitical educational foundation in which we aim to enable young people to act as global citizens, to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. We empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions, of which there are plenty going on in the world today. We work alongside students through our student-led initiative based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, called the International Perspective, in which a team of students led by Hannah help their peers and wider society to be more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as this, we are engaging students from across the UK to think globally on a range of issues from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian tensions. So a bit of background on Jamie. So Jamie was until October 2018, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at Nato headquarters in Brussels. He received worldwide attention during the 1999 Kosovo War, where he served as the spokesperson for NATO. He received his BA honours in modern history and French from the University of Sussex, and his doctor in philosophy in modern history from Lincoln College, Oxford. Currently, Dr. Jamie Shea is Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter and Senior Fellow at Brussels think tank Friends of Europe. His previous roles at NATO include Director of Policy Planning and Deputy Assistant Secretary General for External Relations, alongside many, many others. His many academic positions include Professor at the College of Europe in Bruges and Lecturer at the University of Kent School of International Relations. And of course, most importantly, he is a patron of Team Global as well. So thank you very much, Jamie. The floor is yours.
Okay, Chris, good evening, everybody. Chris, thank you for that extremely kind introduction. The older I get, the more I like to hear it, but the less I deserve it. But thank you. This is my second appearance before Team, and I always get a bit nervous when I have a second invitation, Chris, because it can mean one of either two things. Either you were so brilliant the last time round, they expect a repeat performance, or you were so terrible that they have given you a chance to sort of make amends. So I don't know which of the two it's going to be this evening, but many thanks. As I said, Chris, as we were talking before the show began, I'm really impressed by the way you've put together these sort of excellent series of evening talks, the great turnout. As somebody who got to know Team way back in the 1980s, it's really great to see this organization resuscitated and very much alive. So thanks for all the work, Chris, that you've put in. Thanks, of course, to Anthony. I see Lawrence is also on the call. So keep up the good work. That's all I can say. Anyway, this evening you've asked me to talk about the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So I'll try to sort of sum up in 20-25 minutes max. Chris, start waving your arms vigorously when you see that the clock is running down on me. To sort of give a sense of where I think things are at and where we can go over the next few weeks. And then, of course, happy to take all of the questions in the time that we have. So thank you for everybody for coming along to listen to me this evening. It's a great honor. Now, this is probably the most significant crisis that we've known since the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, the military situation doesn't seem to be getting better, at least from a Western viewpoint, despite the many weeks of diplomacy that have already been ongoing. Notwithstanding, all of the leaders flying to Moscow at the moment, and more in the next few days, with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz planning his visit next week to both Moscow and to Kiev. The flurry of foreign ministers that have also made the trip. This has really been almost like a Congress of Vienna of diplomacy, such as we've never seen before. Even the Americans say that they've held so far over 130 different meetings with their European counterparts since the crisis began. But despite this enormous effort and all of the planes which have been loading more CO2 emissions into the skies as diplomats fly around, still unfortunately no de-escalation on the military front. The Russians have got about 130,000 troops on the borders with Ukraine at the moment. They have gone from about 60 tactical battalion groups, the units in which they fight, over the last 10 days to about 84 tactical battalion groups. The US calculates that about 1/3 of the entire Russian military, not in absolute numbers, but in terms of equipment, in terms of firepower, has been amassed. Rather than use conscript troops that only do 12-month service in Russia today, and therefore are not particularly battle-hardened or reliable, but Putin has really been trying to pull his best forces onto the Ukrainian border, even taking them from as far away as Sakhalin and the far Middle East. It's noteworthy that 20 years ago, when Russia and China had not negotiated the resolution of their border dispute and did not have the cordial relations that President Putin and President Xi have today, you saw the summit just before the Winter Olympics in Beijing last week. This would have been almost unthinkable that Russia could leave its other flank so exposed and put all of its forces on the Ukrainian border. Experts also believe about 50% of the totality of the Russian air force is being deployed to the region as well. What's worrying is the number of options that Putin has currently giving himself if he decides to act. He can invade from the north, particularly, pardon me? Oh, sorry, I heard somebody come in there. I thought Putin could invade from the north through Belarus. The military exercise is called Allied Resolve, a very NATO title that started just a couple of days ago in Belarus with 30,000 Russian troops plus Belarusian forces. They're taking place in 3 particular locations, which are about only 80 miles from Kiev, which is only 47 miles from the Belarusian border. So that would allow Putin, if he chose that option, to basically split Ukraine into 2 quite easily. But he's also got sizable forces on the border just facing Kharkiv, one of the largest Ukrainian cities, a Russian-speaking city, if he chooses to carve out more territory in the Russophone areas of eastern Ukraine. He's also increased in the last few days his amphibious and maritime forces in the Sea of Azov and off the coast of Odessa, giving him a kind of southern strategy, for example, to establish a land link, which does not exist at the moment, between Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, and Russia itself, no longer relying upon the bridge that Putin constructed across the Kerch Strait. This would be paralyzing for Ukraine because Ukraine has 4 ports on the Sea of Azov, notably Mariupol and Berdyansk, which are very important for its shipments to Africa and elsewhere of wheat, of steel, of sunflower oil, and so on. Already, I've been reading, interestingly, reports of Africans complaining that their wheat imports have gone down because of this disruption, that even before an invasion, the disruption that Russian maritime activity in the Sea of Azov is having on blocking Ukrainian trade, as the Ukrainian expert told me the other day, Putin is sort of bringing down the Ukrainian economy simply through the threat of force without actually having to invade, in terms of money coming out of banks, investment decisions being postponed, general run on the Ukrainian markets. And finally, of course, there's the easy option, which would simply be to occupy with regular Russian troops, rather than the irregulars that have been used since 2014, the Donbass region, where Putin could organize another sort of quick.
We know all this. He's just, it's Russian.
Sorry, somebody else
Veronica,
is.
could you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I'm not sure if somebody wants to ask me a question already, or say, Shea, we totally disagree with everything you're saying. Complete nonsense. Please stop talking. Okay, thanks, Chris. So, the easy option where Putin would occupy the Donbass formally, organize a referendum, and then announce that it's a new province of Russia in the same way that he dealt with the Crimea back in March 2014. So lots of different options that go from something which would be a salami slice type of operation, building around the current Russian footholds, to a much larger operation to actually occupy Ukraine. What would he be doing? Well, experts, of course, don't know. We have to speculate. It could be to change the government and put a Moscow-friendly a puppet government in its stead, which would quickly, of course, renounce any aspiration towards membership of NATO, and announce a new treaty of friendship and cooperation with Moscow. It could simply be to make Zelensky himself, the current president, a puppet, who also would come under severe pressure to declare a return of Ukraine to neutrality. He may want to occupy the country for a long period, although the problem there is that with 130,000 troops, he has enough for an invasion, but not a great deal for an occupation. And of course, what's different about Ukraine is that the spirit of nationalism is strong. You've seen the mayor of Moscow, the former heavyweight champion of the world, Vitaly Klitschko, organize popular resistance. The Russians know from the experience of everybody, including the Russians in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, that determined local resistance, even militia forces armed with weapons such as stingers, can basically inflict quite considerable damage and casualties, even on professional soldiers, if the fighting goes into urban areas and takes the form of an insurrection. The Americans have estimated that maybe 50,000 Ukrainians would die in an initial invasion. But of course, many Russians over a period of time, if the resistance is determined, would lose their lives as well. Putin, of course, grew up during the period of Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion of 1979. He knows that the Russians lost 15,000 troops there. He knows that the invasion provoked a unified Afghan resistance and that Russia was forced out 10 years later, and that this was one of the major causal factors in the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. So Western defense experts have trouble believing that a full-scale occupation of Ukraine is something that would really be in the Russian strategic interest. But we also know that in dealing with Afghanistan in 1979, the Soviet General Staff advised Brezhnev and the Politburo not to go in, but the political leadership overruled the military and went ahead. And this is one of the big issues that I think we face in this crisis, in trying to figure out what Putin intends to do. Is he going to invade? If so, in which way and when? Every piece of Western rationality suggests that this would be a big mistake. Russia could get bogged down. If the Ukrainians maul the Russian army, Russia would lose 1/3 of its entire military force. This would not be good for Putin going into the presidential elections in 2024. There's also the question of why invade a country that you are already undermining quite successfully without invading, at least through the two occupations thus far. of Crimea and the Donbass, which make NATO membership much more difficult for Ukraine, by undermining Ukraine with cyber attacks. There was one just a couple of weeks ago, interference in the elections, penetration of business networks, and so on. You know, if the hybrid warfare tactic destabilizes a country you don't particularly like at minimal cost, why then incur the massive extra costs and, of course, the international opprobrium and all of the sanctions and the greater confrontation with NATO that would come from an actual occupation? But of course, the problem is that there's no evidence that this is the kind of language that Putin understands, the currency of Western rationality. He could be driven entirely by emotions and a sense that this is the moment, because delaying further means that the Ukrainian army, armed by the West, is likely to become more powerful, more capable, at least to inflict more serious damage on the Russian forces. That Putin's position at home, with the obviously difficult economic circumstances, could become more difficult as well. And therefore, if you're going to do this, probably now is the very best time. On the other hand, Putin may have made the miscalculation that because NATO was forced into a somewhat humiliating retreat from Kabul on the 15th of August, that somehow the alliance is sort of weak and divided. But as I'm always pointing out in all my talks and articles, knowing NATO, there is a massive difference between NATO not quite succeeding, to say the least, in an out-of-area operation where allies were engaged in very different ways, to the core business of NATO, Article 5 and collective defense, where NATO is performing on much more familiar ground, but much better. So Putin may have miscalculated the Western strength. The real problem, while I just say my final word on the Russian military tactics, is that, of course, that Putin has spent so much money over so many months, you know, like the grand old Duke of York marching the troops to the top of the hill and trying to use the military instrument to gain political advantage, that it's very difficult for him now to climb down, tail between his legs, and send all of the troops back to barracks, not having achieved any kind of diplomatic success. So will he feel as if boxed in, you know, to either lash out or at least try to extract some kind of concession that he could portray as a Russian diplomatic triumph? The good news is the diplomacy goes on, and the Russians clearly are still willing to keep the talking going. The West also has put on a surprisingly united front on an issue. Russia, which traditionally has divided, for example, Germany from the United States, Southern Europe from Northern Europe, Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and so on. I think Putin has been generally surprised at how well the Western Front has stood up so far in the kinds of messages that he's hearing from everybody. Now, of course, there have been some outliers like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who was in Moscow a couple of days, feeling very sympathetic for the Russian line and getting extra Russian gas supplies in return. Yes, there have been German and Italian business groups that again have expressed their reservations about the way in which the West is standing up to Putin. It's never going to be a totally sort of harmonious family, but nonetheless, I think that, you know, NATO's put on quite a good show of unity here. When the Russians came to the NATO-Russia Council 3 weeks ago to talk to the 30 allies and put their demands on the table, I think they were pretty taken aback by the sense of solidarity on this. The United States has played it brilliantly in terms of engaging Europe, standing up to Moscow, not doing anything over the heads of the Europeans, let alone the Ukrainians, by doing sort of direct deals with Putin. Blinken, the Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, Karen Donfried, the major actors in American foreign policy, have spent virtually all of their time in Europe over the last few weeks. There's been meeting after meeting after meeting, so that everybody knows before they go to Moscow what happened in the previous conversation, how to build on any openings, and what firm line to take. So Western unity, I think, has been very encouraging. Now, the rub of all of this is, how do we get get out of the situation that we are in at the moment? Well, the classical approach of the West, since the time of the Cold War, has been to offer a mixture of carrots and sticks, or sticks in terms of deterrence and raising the price of any aggression so that the consequences outweigh the benefits, or the risks become less less fathomable for Russia. And of course, carrots, because with somebody like Putin, you need to offer what John Kerry, the former US Secretary of State, used to call off-ramps, face-saving ways to climb down before you are you paint yourself into a corner, and the only alternative is to lash out and take the risk of war. These carrots and sticks have tended to work in the past. They did work last March when Putin did something similar on the border with Ukraine, with a similar build-up at the time, although less lengthy and less major than what we have seen today, where the Americans think, for example, that the Russian troops are about 70% ready for a potential attack. And of course, Western observers are worried by the fact that they're bringing up things like field hospitals and blood supplies, which you don't normally get on military exercises, but which you do bring up when you have a serious intention to attack. So let's look at the sticks first. Well, first of all, there is the threat of sanctions, which would be massively more significant than what we've seen before, where we looked at so-called Magnitsky sanctions, named after the Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who died in prison, and which have been targeting mainly sort of corrupt oligarchs or Russian officials, freezing their assets in bank accounts in the West that they don't have anyway, not a particularly great deterrent. This time, the idea is to go for the jugular of the Russian economy in terms of blocking Russian banks' access to foreign capital, to foreign debt, the ability to trade on the dollar markets, for instance, maybe taking Russia out of the international payments clearance system, SWIFT, which would make it very difficult for Russia to be paid for its oil and gas supplies to Europe or the rest of the world, blocking off technology like during the Cold War to the Soviet Union, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, consumer electronics, these kind of things. And of course, the Americans have put massive pressure on Germany to put the Nord Stream 2 pipeline into the balance. Scholz was a little bit cautious when he was talking to the press in Washington this week, but Biden went ahead and said that Scholz, in their private meeting, had told him that Nord Stream 2 would be in the balance, as Chancellor Merkel had given the engagement before, that Germany would simply not certify the pipeline, at least under current circumstances. Now, of course, the big question is that sanctions, to be effective, have to deter before the invasion and not simply be used as punishment post facto after the invasion has taken place. So the first big issue is, which sanctions do you roll out now to show that you're serious to reinforce the deterrent, and which sanctions do you keep as a response after the invasion? It's not easy to get consensus in NATO or the EU on sanctions before the crime has taken place, just like it's very difficult to lock up the criminal before he has committed his bank robbery. The second big issue is, which sanctions do you announce in advance so Putin knows exactly what he's getting and therefore can decide if he's deterred or not? And which sanctions do you keep secret so that you keep your adversary guessing? The third big question about sanctions is that basically, could Putin wiggle out of them? Now, there's a big debate amongst Western experts on this at the moment. Putin was in China, I mentioned that, and he signed 15 business deals with the Chinese, including a deal to provide 10 billion cubic meters of gas to China, along with many other things like arms deals and so on. And so one group of experts believe that, with help from China, particularly on the capital front. By the way, these deals were done in euros, interestingly, in order to keep Russia as far as possible out of dollar transactions where extraterritorial American sanctions could apply. So that's the thing, will China compensate for a Western embargo on Russia? Secondly, the Russians are not idiots. Of course they're not. They've known for many years that they could be in this situation. And Putin, a little bit like Ceausescu in the communist period in Romania, has driven down the Russian foreign debt. It's very, very low. He's built a sovereign wealth fund of about $150 billion that he can play around with. He's been trying to decouple from the dollar economy where he can. He's made the oligarchs bring their capital home already under threat of expropriation. So have this combination of measures of Chinese help plus decoupling, have they put Russia in a position where it could effectively ride out the sanctions? Undoubtedly, the sanctions will tell, but how long will they take to actually grip? So there's the question there. The second issue is arm Ukraine. In terms of the package of deterrence, that the more the Ukrainians can mount resistance and inflict casualties on the Russians, the more Putin has to worry about body bags coming home, as with Afghanistan, or more recently, Chechnya, for example. Now here, of course, the NATO countries have done quite a bit. The Americans have programmed $500 billion of lethal military assistance. A new package of American assistance landed in Kiev this afternoon. The Americans are giving Ukrainians a Stinger anti-aircraft and Javelin anti-tank missiles, counter-battery radars, ships, corvettes, command and control, intelligence on the Russian military movements to help them be prepared for what's coming, particularly tip-offs about Russian propaganda campaigns to find a casus belli, some fake operation that the Russians can blame on Ukraine, pretexting that Ukraine has attacked Russia, not the other way around. The question is how quickly can this equipment be delivered to the front line? How quickly can the Ukrainian army be trained to use it? Number one. UK has also got into the game as well, particularly with help with Ukrainian naval construction, Brimstone missiles and the rest. Other allies, the Czechs, have been providing some as well. Of course, there's been a lot of criticism of the Germans for offering 5,000 helmets to great derision in Kiev, rather than significant lethal assistance, even blocking the supply of old East German howitzers that were donated to Lithuania, blocking the Lithuanians from exporting those howitzers to Ukraine. So it's not a totally happy picture, but nonetheless, the Ukrainians have 250,000 regular troops, 200,000 reservists. They have many militias, not always very nice militias, some very right wing, but militias that have fought in the Donbass and know their business. So it's not going to be a pushover, although the Ukrainian army is very weak when it comes to air defense. But if this military assistance can get to the front line fast enough, the Ukrainians will be able to make life difficult for the Russians. The problem here is it's a double-edged sword, ladies and gentlemen, because on the one hand, giving assistance to the Ukrainians increases deterrence, but it may also induce Putin to think, as I said earlier, well, if these guys are getting stronger, I'm going to go now before, the javelins are fully operational in the front line. Turkey, by the way, also, contrary to what you may think of its dalliance with Russia, Turkey has been providing considerable military assistance to Ukraine, above all, the Bayraktar TB2 drones, which have already been used by the Ukrainians in the Donbass. Moscow has screamed about this because these are really very effective things. The Turkish TB2 drones were devastating when the Azeris used them against the Armenian army in Nagorno-Karabakh in the war of 2020. So this is something that the Russians would be worried about. And you've probably seen from BBC pictures that they've been equipping their tanks with drone shields in recognition of that particular threat. The third aspect of deterrence is to reduce dependency on Russian gas. This can't be done overnight. because Russia supplies 40% of Europe's gas. And you've seen from multiple statements by experts and politicians that Gazprom has been using gas as a weapon in the crisis by reducing supplies along the Yamal pipeline, for example, by only delivering minimal contractual supplies, by clearly favouring countries like Hungary that toe the Kremlin line. And of course, the Russians are gleefully seeing the way in which gas prices are going up in Europe. Inflation is back on the rise. But it's been a mild winter. Stocks in Europe, about 40%, will get us through, even if they're getting a little bit on the low side. And the Russian gas weapon has been a powerful fillip to the EU to come up with new ideas for bulk buying of gas for storage. Japan has offered Europe gas. The US has had summits with Qatar to get Qatar to provide more liquefied natural gas. Europe has been going ahead building LNG terminals, Germany, Croatia, Poland, Lithuania. The Americans have agreed to divert their own LNG to Europe. The EU has been talking to Norway, to Algeria, to Nigeria to diversify supply. And this is only going to speed up the greening of the European economy away from fossil fuels, which in the long run is going to be devastating for a Russian economy, which is still largely dependent upon fossil fuel production and export. So Putin knows that in the long run, the Europeans' gas diversification is going to deprive him of a powerful lever. So the final element is reinforcing of NATO. If Putin felt that this was a crisis that would intimidate NATO, then he's been proved wrong. He indeed has conflated a crisis over Ukraine to get even on a country which, as long as it's a democratic Slav country with Russian speakers living in a democracy, is always going to be a threat to his own authoritarian control at home. He would love Ukraine to be similar to Belarus, of course, but he's hidden in a Ukrainian crisis a much larger challenge to the European security order that we built up after the Cold War, based, of course, on certain principles like the right of countries to join an alliance if they so wish, and equality of security for all, and moving away from classical spheres of influence from the 19th century. It's amazing that every time Putin talks about Europe and security, he always looks backwards to the 19th century, backwards to former models of Russia, particularly to Tsarist times. He never looks forward to any kind of future division. His references are always nostalgically in the past. And so instead of intimidating NATO, we've seen quite the reverse. I mentioned, the Americans sending additional reinforcements. The British, Boris Johnson's in Brussels today, having offered 1,000 extra British forces to go to Poland, doubling the size of the British contingent in Estonia, sending troops to Romania. France has offered to head up a new multinational brigade in Romania, which should be agreed by NATO defense ministers next week. The Dutch have offered extra forces and so on. There's been a real flurry of reinforcing NATO's flank. And Putin knows that the more he tries to bully Ukraine, the more likelihood that those reinforcements will remain in Eastern Europe. They won't go home after the crisis. And indeed, at its Madrid summit, coming up very soon in June, NATO is likely to give up its strategy of reinforcing Eastern Europe in a crisis, only keeping very light forces permanently or persistently stationed in the East. And we're likely to go back to a kind of Cold War posture of heavy tank divisions in the East on the front line, providing immediate defense and deterrence as we did then. So Sweden and Finland, which would not have remotely considered joining NATO before the crisis, are now reopening the debate also on their membership. Now, what are the off-ramps? Well, the first off-ramp or way out of the crisis in terms of a diplomatic solution is, number one, to go back to Minsk II. By that, I mean the agreement of February 2015 between the Russians and the Ukrainians to negotiate a decentralized autonomous status for the Donbass. That's not made much progress because basically the Ukrainians want the Russians to remove their troops before they organize an election under their constitution, under international supervision, whereas the Russians say, oh, no, you go ahead and, we have all of the decentralization in the Donbass first, and then afterwards we may or may not remove our troops and demobilize the militias. The problem that the Ukrainians have is that if they negotiate a solution for the Donbass under Russian rule, then the Donbass will become a kind of blocking minority in any revision of the Ukrainian constitution and any decision to join NATO. It's like the UK going for devolution, where we say to Wales, you will have a blocking minority on any significant vote concerning UK politics. And the Ukrainians fear that this will be a lever to give Russia a permanent droit de regard over their affairs. But there is a lot of activity at the moment, including a meeting in Berlin tomorrow of diplomats in the so-called Normandy format, if you know about that, ladies and gentlemen, to try to come up with some kind of new approach, more for more, you do this, I do that, phased approach of the political side, the security side, so that the Ukrainians are willing to move ahead because they have some kind of guarantee that the Donbass will remain within the Ukrainian constitution. But that could be presented by Putin if he wants to, it's up to him, as the kind of sort of thing where he said, hey, I got this thing going again. So that's one thing. The second
Jamie,
thing,
could we wrap up in the next couple of minutes so we've got time for Q&A? Thank you.
The second thing, Chris, I'll wrap up very quickly, is arms control measures. You've seen a lot about this. Both NATO and Russia have been moaning for some time about each other's military posture. And NATO has said, look, the way out of this crisis is let's have, lots more military confidence building measures that can deal with the issues that you have on, nuclear weapons, exercises, snap exercises, troops along borders, and so on. Both NATO and Russia have an interest in this. Again, Putin could present that if he wanted to. Number three, a general dialogue on European security. For some time, it's been clear that Russia and NATO interpret principles in very different ways. Indivisibility of security. What does that mean? No one should have security at the expense of somebody else. What does that mean? The right of countries to join alliances. Well, which right? Subject to whose approval? Legitimate security interests. And one of the things clearly which we are not going to avoid is to start a dialogue with Russia to try to explain why we interpret these concepts differently, what they mean, and try to come closer together. The big problem is that Russia accuses NATO of organizing the European security framework around NATO's interests. And we're seeing in the Ukrainian crisis that Russia is trying to organize the entire European security framework around its interests. So how do we sort of, come to some middle ground here? Just recalling, Chris, as I stop, I promise, what Henry Kissinger famously said when he said that absolute security for the Soviet Union means absolute insecurity for everybody else. How do we escape that paradigm? So those are the three off-ramps. So Chris, as I end, there are three ways we're going to go forward on this one. Number one, we stick to our guns and don't give up on our principles. We have a few nervous weeks like the Cuban Missile Crisis, a few nail-biting weeks, but we stick to our guns and eventually Putin climbs down. Number two, we do a dirty deal because we're more worried about war than anything else. And we oblige Ukraine to accept neutrality with some kind of Russian guarantee, but there is no evidence that Russia ever respected Ukrainian neutrality in the past. And the Ukrainians will say, well, if we're going to be neutral, do we get Donbass back? And do we get Crimea back? And Putin will say no. So a dirty deal, rather like a Munich, another Munich, 1938, where everybody, Neville Chamberlain, everybody breathes a sigh of relief that we've avoided war. But buyer's remorse, within a year or so, when Putin comes back asking for more, we realize that this has not solved the fundamental problem. But there are people who will be tempted by that, sacrifice Ukraine and Georgia and have peace. Number three, war. That despite all of our best efforts, Putin will still decide that he can get away with it. He wants to be Tsar Nicholas I, who has sort of expanded the Tsarist empire, will go down in history. And we will have to adapt, unfortunately, to a new Cold War situation of two confrontational blocs in Europe for many years to come. I, of course, hope that it will be outcome number one, but there is still a possibility of outcome two and outcome three.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Very comprehensive and very insightful. So thank you very much once again. We've already had some brilliant questions coming through so far. So in the interest of trying to get through as many of them as possible, perhaps we can rattle through them. So I'll start off with Michael's question. And he says, given the population of Crimea is 65% ethnic Russians and only 16% ethnic Ukrainian, does Russia have a strong case for the continued occupation and annexation of Crimea?
Mike, I gave a long intro, so I'm going to answer the questions very briefly, Chris, telegraph style. There's a big difference between the Donbass and Crimea. Donbass, not yet incorporated into Russia. Ukrainians have got a big stake there, and their own armed forces are in the region too, so they haven't given it up. Number two, Donbass is where people are dying all the time. 14,000 killed already, big population displacement, and where the UN, Jan Egeland, a former UN human rights envoy, was there yesterday and reports that 2 million people would be in severe humanitarian distress if war broke out. And there's a negotiating framework which still gives Ukraine some hope of regaining control of the Donbass. So if I'm a diplomat, you have to make choices, focus on Donbass and not at the moment on Crimea, because it's less likely that we'll get, whatever we feel morally about it, it's less likely we'll get any concessions from Russia over Crimea. That was quick, Chris.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. Next one comes from Luboyev, and they ask, how likely do you think it is that the British government will investigate the Russian property in Britain to prevent Russian oligarchs' money laundering in London?
Well, yeah, given the fact that many Russian citizens, oligarchs now have British citizenship, own property, have donated to the Conservative Party, I think a root and branch look at this would be difficult. But on the other hand, I mean, the UK post-Brexit wants to be a big financial center. It doesn't want Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam or Wall Street to get all of the business. The City of London, generates 11% of UK GDP. It's important. And you're not going to maintain that status if you develop a reputation for money laundering, for shonky business, for non-transparent deals, flotations and all the rest. Chinese money, by the way, comes in here. So I think that, the UK will concentrate on that side of affairs, cleaning up the transactions in the City of London. But I don't quite see it taking away the ownership of Chelsea Football Club from Roman Abramovich anytime soon.
Brilliant, thank you. And that kind of rolls on nicely to a question from Alex, and he kind of reverts back to Nord Stream 2. How likely do you think is the SWIFT, in big bold letters, disconnect and the closure of Nord Stream 2 as sanctions or deterrence measures?
The problem with sanctions, Chris, is you've got to hurt the other guy, but without hurting yourself. And it's all very well to talk about sanctions, but when you start looking at the details, you realize, maybe you need to change your law to implement them. For example, the EU constantly has a problem when it wants to come up with sanctions that the lawyers in the Commission say, we can't do this unless we change the law first. And that can be very time consuming. And the problem, of course, with SWIFT, as the Germans point out, is if we take the Russians out of SWIFT, we can't actually pay for the things that we import from Russia, like gas supplies. And then Gazprom would probably turn off the taps entirely, not for political reasons, but purely for financial reasons. It's not getting paid. And so people who rushed into SWIFT at first, seeing it as the nuclear option, we're really going to get them here, have suddenly sort of realized that maybe it's a double-edged weapon. And a lot of work's been going on across the Atlantic, a lot of work, between the economics ministries and the US Treasury Department to try to come up with things that will hurt Russia, but not so much us. Now, Nord Stream 2 also is such a political football, Chris, and to the questions in the US Congress and in Eastern Europe. It's such a political football that the Germans know that they would be pilloried if they didn't put Nord Stream 2 in the mix. And the fact that it's not been activated yet sort of makes it easier for them to do so. So I think that SWIFT has gone a bit quiet recently because it's a double-edged sword. And I think now, given the big sort of strategic activity around Nord Stream 2, where the Congress has been trying to preempt Ted Cruz has introduced legislation in the Congress to try to preempt Biden by already sanctioning Nord Stream 2. The political pressure is such that Biden knows that if Nord Stream 2 isn't there, he's really, really going to take the heat at home.
Brilliant. And kind of building on that economic focus, Michael mentions that, the GDP is the GDP of Russia is no larger than that of Belgium and the Netherlands combined. So is it not backwards for the Russian economy? It's very highly vulnerable to these Western countermeasures. Is it not quite a backward sort of policy that the Russians are taking at the moment?
Yeah, I would say yes, but the problem we always have when we look at Russia, as I tried to say, is that we feel that because we're looking at the world through one side of the telescope, everybody looks at the world through one side of the telescope too. And if any of you have sat down, I'm sure you have, and spent some time with Russian diplomats or politicians, you realize that isn't the way it works. They really do see the world in international relations through a completely different lens, and they think that they're the ones who are being rational and logical. Listen to a politician like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And we're the ones who have been patently ridiculous. The thing about Russia is that you're right in sort of abstract power terms. It's much weaker, but abstract power terms don't matter. What matters is what you've got locally and your willingness to use it. And Russia has a sizable military force, which is extensively modernized, and it's willing to use it, both for coercion and intimidation, and even for military operations in a localized area where it's up against weaker opponents. It's not attacking NATO, it's attacking states in between, like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, exploiting the ambiguity of the West, which wants to help these countries, but knows that because they are not NATO members, we are not actually going to use military force, equivalent currency, to oppose that. So the risks for Putin are much less in using military force in his neighborhood than it would be if he used military force against the United States or NATO. So forget about, abstract power. What it counts is the guy who is able to instrumentalize his power assets to maximum advantage in a particular moment for a particular cause on the day. And that's why David usually beats Goliath.
Brilliant. And sort of looking a bit further east, Ra says, aside from the Putin-Xi meetings and business deals mentioned, what, if any, direct Chinese influence or interest do you think is affecting or will affect this crisis?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, what I think worries Western strategies is that the way in which China has changed its fundamental principles of international relations to support Russia, particularly as the richer, more powerful partner, right? Not the supplicant. For example, China was a big supporter of Ukraine because it invests very heavily in Ukraine. One Belt, One Road, energy projects, infrastructure, ports. The Ukrainians have been supplying China with aircraft engines and so on. So, one would have thought that China would have tried very hard to rein Russia in order to preserve a very close economic relationship with Ukraine. It hasn't done so. Number two, when Russia invaded Georgia or even annexed Crimea, the Chinese kept quiet. They didn't support Russia at all because they are very much their foreign policy principles been non-interference, state sovereignty, non-interference. And therefore, the idea of a state attacking another state is something that they felt uncomfortable with, notwithstanding the fact that they like Putin because he's an authoritarian like he is. But what is worrying, I think, Chris, is that in this joint declaration that they produced last week of 5,000 words, the Chinese more or less sign up to everything that Russia's doing, condemnation of NATO, military buildup, all of the playbook of Russian grievances against NATO, enlargement and all of that. The Chinese have sort of endorsed, and one wonders why, because as the senior partner, what are they getting in return? Some extra gas, Russian aircraft, help with their shipbuilding program and so on. It's almost as if these two authoritarian states feel a bit lonely in the world, being hemmed in by the United States and the democracies, and now sort of turning to each other for succor or support. Of course, the Russians naturally gave the Chinese backing vis-a-vis Taiwan. We wait to see if President Xi is going to use that, particularly if the West is bogged down in Ukraine as a smokescreen, that then he can use to move against Taiwan, because dictators often wait for an opportunity of, their opponents being bogged down elsewhere to seize their own prize. So I think we're going to keep an eye on it. In other words, what I want to say here, sorry to give a slightly longer answer, Chris, here, but it is a very, very important question. A while ago, the West felt that we could play the Chinese and the Russians off against each other. Neither would want to be the junior partner. They had different interests. The Chinese need the global economy because they're a trading nation more than the Russians. And eventually, the Chinese would dump the Russians. But we are being confounded by the fact that this, not an alliance, but this partnership between Russia and China, the authoritarians sort of getting together to support each other. They're even now planning to launch a space station to the moon in 2 years' time. This is proving to have much more life to it than we had before. And the problem is that Biden, came into office saying, forget Russia. I want to sort of devote my energies to China, the real problem. But Putin is saying, I'm not going to let you do that, Joe. I'm going to sort of keep you busy with crises that are going to make me your biggest headache. And secondly, I'm going to come so close to the Chinese that you won't be able to deal with the Chinese without dealing with me as a partnership. So, I think it's a worrying factor. We felt that divorce was inevitable, and they're sort of, renewing their marriage vows every week.
Brilliant. And just coming on to one of James's observations, he states that in his analysis that the UK remains the US's new sort of Cold War propaganda frontman. Obviously, with the current government, number 10, and sort of their global Britain agenda, I suppose you could say. How true do you think this is?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. Yes, let's be frank about it. After Brexit, the UK has gone back to its history, the special relationship it believes with the United States, the renewal of Commonwealth links, Australia, AUKUS, all of the people we're talking to are people who are sort of former Commonwealth countries, where links, particularly in defence area, have still remained strong. And we sent our aircraft carrier on its maiden voyage to the Indo-Pacific, but through the Eastern Mediterranean and through a NATO exercise first. So yes, that is the default position. And of course, Britain has shown no interest whatsoever in any kind of defence or security cooperation beyond terrorism or migrants with the European Union thus far. But two things. Number one, I think that because we've left the EU, Boris Johnson is very keen. He's in Brussels today. He's at NATO headquarters today, and Poland, to show that the UK is still a big player in European security through NATO. With all of these offers of extra troops, and even a Type 45 frigate could be sent. So, the UK is making a big effort there. And of course, the UK loves the fact that this is a NATO crisis where the EU is non-existent, to show that, when the tough gets, when the going gets tough, only NATO is the only game in town. Forget the EU, divided, can't do a thing. And we're big players in NATO. So once again, you sort of see that when it's a crisis, it's all about the Quad, the big boys, the French, the Germans, the Americans, and the UK were at the top table. That's what really matters. So about the other thing, Chris, is that, of course, the relationship with the United States is going to pull the Brits into the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS, the aircraft carrier, other things to show solidarity with the United States vis-a-vis China. And will the UK defence budget over the next 10 years, really allow the UK to sort of be a big actor in NATO, with doubling its troops in Estonia, committing to a much bigger presence in Europe against a more threatening Russia, to maintain its position at the top table of NATO. Will the UK defence budget allow that, and boosting up the Royal Navy to be able to send all kinds of aircraft carriers and destroyers to the Indo-Pacific? The real danger for the UK is what happened to the Russian Imperial Fleet in 1905 when war broke out against Japan, and the Russian Imperial Fleet was in the North Sea, and it took 8 months. Okay, it's a bit faster today, but it took 8 months, remember, for that Russian fleet to sort of get all of the way back up to Sakhalin, to be completely obliterated by the Japanese fleet when they got there. I mean, it's not exactly a fitting historical parallel, but there is going to be a problem of, dividing up the cake thinly across a large number of global Britain commitments that the UK is now entering into. And I think sooner or later, strategic choices in Whitehall will have to be made.
Brilliant. And you mentioned previously that Russians are at 70% prepared readiness. How would you assess Ukraine's military and militia, and how prepared do you think they are from Alex, and how likely do you think an attack is on Kiev from the north?
Yes, well, I think Putin wants those options. Whether these are options, Chris and Alex, just purely to sort of increase leverage, intimidation, put more pressure on Ukraine by showing that Russia has options, or whether Russia is seriously contemplating an invasion, I don't know. I mean, in a way, Kiev, if you know Ukraine, is really in the center of the country towards the north, and Russia has 30,000 troops. So yes, it could take Kiev, but it couldn't take much of Ukraine around Kiev. And meanwhile, the bulk of Russian forces are several hundred kilometers away in areas of the country where the Ukrainians, because of Donbass or Crimea, and the Sea of Azov, had significant military forces. So in many ways, the Russian army would split into two between a northern invasion and trying to bring forces in from the east. And we know that, Napoleon showed at the Battle of Waterloo, that is when you split your army into two, you lose, right? and the other guy keeps his army together. So to some degree, I'm not particularly convinced by the Northern Seize Kiev strategy. I think if Putin's going to do something, the idea of using the bulk of your forces going into the east, where you already have, Donbass, Crimea, proxy forces, control of the Sea of Azov, logistics, makes a lot better sense. I mean, if the Russians did try to invade from the north, I think they would have to take sizable Belarusian forces with them, which would mean that Lukashenko would more or less, ruin any chance of having any relationship at any time in the future with the West. Would the Belarusians, with their opposition to Lukashenko, though it's died down a bit because of repression, would they want their countrymen to be involved in a military invasion alongside Moscow of a fellow Slav nation? Already in Russia, opinion polls show that there is no appetite for killing Slav brothers, given many family links into marriages. They may have liked Crimea because it was quick and dirty, but like anywhere, as soon as you start losing forces, enthusiasm dies down. So in other words, I think the northern route is only possible if Belarus gets totally involved. And the question is really Lukashenko really willing to go that far? And what would be the consequences for his own rule at home? So lots of imponderables here. Good question, though.
Brilliant. Lawrence, I see you putting your hand up. Would you like to come onto the mic?
Jamie, thank you very much for all of that. As I struggle to understand what's been happening, one question keeps popping into my head. Why now? Why did all this happen at this point? What was it that drove Putin to make this extraordinary aggressive action by, as it were, surrounding the Ukraine?
Lawrence, that is a great question. I'd even say it's the $64,000 question. There's not a simple answer, because you recall that the occupation and the annexation of Crimea, plus the move into the Donbass, all took place back in 2014. At a time when the EU, not NATO, the EU had concluded a comprehensive free trade agreement with Kiev, deep and comprehensive agreement. And you remember at the last minute, the president of Ukraine reneged on that commitment to the EU. And that precipitated, the uprising, demonstrations, call it what you want. The Russians called it a fascist coup d'etat, of course, which meant that you remember that Yanukovych, that president, was forced out of power, had to seek refuge in Russia. So that allowed, so in other words, it was this idea then of Ukraine moving west into a close relation with the EU, but not EU membership, which the EU was not contemplating, not NATO membership, which was promised in a vague way, but was nowhere near, to being realized. NATO diplomats would say, yeah, maybe in 20 or 30 years, we've made a promise, but there's no timetable. So you're right, there's a difference in 2014 where you could argue that Putin had some kind of casus belli in terms of Ukraine taking a decision or reorientating itself. But this time, no. I mean, yes, Putin could say to block enlargement, but NATO was not close, to moving to embracing either Ukraine or Georgia. NATO was not about to offer Ukraine the membership action plan, the sort of the immediate negotiating route. NATO was not, offering to construct military bases or move missiles into Ukraine. So there wasn't an immediate trigger. So we have to speculate, could it be the sense that over time, NATO would give more military assistance to Ukraine, as I've said, and its capacity to resist would be stronger. Go now. Is Putin worried about his domestic base and feels that he needs, particularly with his nationalist forces, to do something dramatic to shore up support at home? The elections are coming in 2024, but then Putin is guaranteed to win those elections. He cheats, he manipulates, the opposition doesn't get to stand. So it's not as if, he'd be worried that, like Boris Johnson, that, Keir Starmer is on the up and he's going to be voted out of power. No. Was it the perception of weakness over NATO, weakness over the situation in Afghanistan, and therefore, NATO is losing its mojo or whatever. I don't see, frankly, I'm not a Russia expert, but I've spoken to a lot of Russia experts, and I don't see that, the Russian army was sort of putting pressure on Putin. We want to go, Vladimir, so give us the green light. Quite the reverse. I think many of them will be extremely worried about all of this and hesitant. The situation in the Donbass was not really moving. I mean, he's obviously frustrated with Ukraine. That's been the case for a long time. He expected Zelensky, when he became president. Zelensky is a Russian speaker, at least in terms of his background. Zelensky came saying, I'm going to do a deal with Putin. Zelensky was elected on, I'll make peace in Donbass and solve this. And I think Putin had some great hopes that he would have somebody who would be easily manipulable and would do his bidding. And instead, Zelensky quite realized that he would never get approval from the Ukrainian population or the nationalist forces to go that way, and he started the Stonewall. And so the frustration has been building up over a period of time. But Lawrence, your question is a great one, and I'm sort of waffling on a bit on this one because I can't really give you an answer. But frankly, I haven't seen anybody even more knowledgeable than me. That's a joke. More knowledgeable than me, who has got a convincing idea of why now. I mean, he's just had a successful intervention in Kazakhstan, where a little bit of force, kept the regime of President Tokayev in power against demonstrations. But again, he wasn't facing, I think, any immediate threat like, a change of power in Kazakhstan that could have undermined his own rule. Good, very, very, very good point about that. And unfortunately, this is a regime in Russia which is far less transparent than the old Politburo of the Soviet Union, which at least had debates and gave us some kind of intelligence insight into what was going on. In the case of Putin and his clique, what they're talking about in the Kremlin is very difficult for even Western intelligence agencies to decipher.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. And I believe that will be our closing question for this evening. So thank you very much to Jamie for spending an hour with us this evening. It's much appreciated. And I'm sure everyone will agree, incredibly insightful. So thank you very much once again, Jamie. Do you have any closing words before we go?
No, I think I've spoken far too much, actually. So just thank you to Chris. As always, thank you, Anthony, Lawrence. As I said, it's great to see team in such a great shape. Stay green. That's the only way to ultimately deal with Russia in the long run.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And thank you very much to everyone for coming this evening. I hope you have a wonderful evening and look forward to welcoming you to our new webinar very soon. Thank you once again.